Hi, my name's Dan Barlow. I work at the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation, based at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about the examples of the influence that the governments can have in supporting action on climate change. So firstly, governments can influence action on climate change in many ways, and this includes how they raise money, for example through taxes, how they spend money, what policies or legislation they develop and implement, and what ambitions they set out, and also the language that they use in referring to climate change. So to give some examples here in Scotland of the influence that are available to the Scottish Government, examples that the Scottish Government have used to date. So in terms of budget, the Scottish Government can decide how much money it spends each year to support improving the energy efficiency of our housing stock. In terms of policy, the Scottish Government can decide what the minimum standard should be for energy efficiency of new homes, and they can decide, as they have done, what their policy is on phasing out of petrol and diesel vehicles. In terms of ambition, they have declared their commitment to become net zero by 2045. And in terms of the language that they use, the Scottish Government have declared a climate emergency, and they're also adopted language around a just transition in their approach to responding to climate change and cutting emissions here in Scotland. Many of these decisions that the Scottish Government have made are also deliberated in the Scottish Parliament. Some of them require approval of the Scottish Parliament to be implemented. By way of policy responsibility or autonomy, the Scottish Parliament has powers to introduce legislation on a wide variety of issues, and these are referred to as devolved. Some issues remain the responsibility of the UK Parliament, i.e. Westminster, and these are called reserved. And this image shows where these responsibilities fall. So you'll see from the image that devolved matters include agriculture, forestry, fisheries, education and the environment, and reserve matters include things like defence, employment and industry. So as you'll see, there are many areas of policy that can have an impact on Scotland's emissions or Scotland's approach to responding to the impact of climate change, which are devolved. And these include, for example, agriculture and transport. There are other significant policy areas where the responsibilities remain in Westminster, for example, around industry policy. In reality, the balance of responsibilities in those areas where policy can have a significant impact on our approach to cutting emissions and responding to climate change is complex. And the Climate Change Committee have mapped out where powers to implement Scotland's commitment to achieve net zero by 2045 fall in relation to between those that are devolved, those that are split between the UK Government and the Scottish Government, and those that remain largely reserved to the UK Government. And you'll see from this image that in a number of areas the key powers to achieve things are largely devolved to the Scottish Government. And this includes actions in areas such as land use, agriculture and waste. But in other areas, the powers remain reserved to the UK Government, and this includes areas like curbing emissions from aviation or reducing emissions from shipping. There is an added complexity which is associated with European powers, and in particular the implications of Brexit. Currently, a number of policy areas which have a significant impact on our ability to cut emissions have been governed by legislation or policy approaches determined at a European level. And these include, for example, the Emissions Trading Scheme, which is an EU-wide scheme designed to curb emissions from industrial activity. But also in other areas, for example, Europe has set minimum standards of efficiency for any vehicles that are sold in European countries. After Brexit, many of the responsibilities that have been held by Europe will come back to the UK Government, and many of these actually fall within devolved areas. So it's likely that Scotland will gain some significant additional areas of responsibility to tackle areas which could have an impact on climate change. But there are discussions underway about where and how these should be implemented in a consistent way across the UK through something called common frameworks.
I'm delighted to have an opportunity today to say a few words and to add to the important work that you're doing. Climate change is clearly one of the biggest challenges that we face, and the COVID pandemic has shown more than ever that we live in a changing world and that radical action is possible if there is the will to carry it out. This is why local government has made clear commitments to net zero. Local authorities across the country have declared climate emergencies, and others have ambitious carbon reduction plans. In COSLA, we've set a strategic goal for a just transition to net zero by no later than 2045. This means three things. Firstly, integrating carbon reduction into every aspect of what local authorities do. Secondly, coming out of COVID in a so-called green recovery. And thirdly, undertaking this transition in a socially fair and equitable way. We have three primary levels of influence here in our local authorities. Firstly, we want to become net zero public bodies. We want to ensure that our own estate, buildings and vehicle fleets become carbon neutral. Secondly, we want to develop net zero supply chains, looking at the services and products we purchase or commission. And thirdly, we want to create net zero places. We want to drive and facilitate change in our local areas, work with local partnerships in the business community, and giving local communities a voice in how high-level climate change goals are translated into concrete action on the ground, and how this can be done in a socially just and fair way. This third level of political leadership is where I think local government can make the greatest impact. And it's also the very sphere where the Climate Assembly has a key role. Let me make two more remarks. COSLA has been very clear from early on that the protection of our biodiversity has to be a key part of the climate change dialogue, and the pandemic has brought this very much home. Equally, the pandemic has shown us how small the world that we inhabit is. That's equally true for climate change, be it rising sea levels, or floods in much poorer countries, or our waste being shipped around the globe. Local government is not just about the delivery of vital services, but it's about the places we live and the lives we lead. If we can pull together and align our ambitions for tackling climate change in the same way we have done for tackling the COVID pandemic, then I believe we have a real chance to make a difference.
Hello everybody. Many thanks for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm sure you're having a fantastically interesting and engaging day. My name's Sam Gardner. I'm the Head of Climate Change and Sustainability for Scottish Power. I've been asked to speak about the role of the business sector in tackling climate change. I think it's really important to just emphasise how diverse the private sector is. There's huge diversity across the business sector, from big multinational corporations to small individual businesses, and the response to climate change clearly has to vary across that spectrum. But the one thing that I think has to be constant is that all businesses, regardless of size, can talk about and engage with the climate challenge. So, the first question is, why should businesses respond to the climate change emergency? And the first thing to say to that is, businesses are made up of people, you and I, and they care about the future just as much as anybody else. They have a vested interest in ensuring that the future is stable, it's predictable. Climate change is a phenomenon brought about by pollution, by the emissions of fossil fuel gases into the atmosphere. And ultimately, that is a waste product. And so businesses should respond because there's huge efficiencies to be gained in responding to climate change and removing those waste products from your work, from your business stream. Any business that wishes to have a social contract with the public that enables it to operate into the future ultimately has to be part of and seen to be engaging in solutions to climate change. You will have heard over the course of your time as part of the Climate Assembly just the high levels of public engagement that exist around climate change. A business has to engage with the big challenges that face society, and climate change is right up there. So, of course, the business sector is faced with a whole suite of different risks that come under the heading of climate change. They're cumulative, they're systemic, they're unpredictable. Ultimately, they don't follow a linear pattern. And so it's really important to engage with those risks. And some of those are just to try and identify some of them. There are physical risks that can render your business model obsolete or certainly increase your costs. There are price risks that become because of the vulnerability of the supply chain to spikes in price as a result of the impacts of climate change. There are also product risks. Your product may well become obsolete in a net zero world if you're producing coal. There are risks that span the spectrum of the ways in which businesses operate. And out with those value chain risks, there are reputational risks and there are regulatory risks about how governments and policymakers respond to the climate crisis by introducing new measures to cut emissions and to steer businesses towards a low carbon future. So what should businesses do to respond? Well, they should do, there's any number of different things, but most importantly, the first of those is that they have to cut their emissions in line with what's known as science-based targets. More and more companies are committing themselves to what's called a 1.5 degree emissions trajectory in line with the Paris Agreement in order to cut emissions to net zero. And that's the kind of 101. We have to start by cutting our emissions across our entire supply chain, across our value chain and our own operations. We also should first and foremost talk about climate change. We all have audiences, whether they be customers or other businesses, and we should definitely be engaging and communicating about climate change. We should be advocates for leadership on climate change from decision makers. We should champion those that are willing to take a stand and push forward in response to climate change. We should also be very mindful of the nature of the transition and ensure that we're guiding and supporting and enabling a just transition to a fairer future. And importantly, for many of us who have large numbers of staff, we should engage and educate those staff as to the nature of the net zero transition. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on some of the challenges and opportunities that the climate challenge presents to the private sector. So in terms of opportunities, the absolute carbon envelope, the limit that it poses on our operating future, drives innovation. And in turn, that can help create new jobs, this will create new technologies and new solutions to problems. It can help us cut costs and be more efficient. And of course, it can inspire and lead others. But it's not, of course, without its challenges. We have to be prepared to work with imperfect knowledge and take risks. We have to be able to learn while we're doing, and we have to operate within what is often a dynamic policy environment as policymakers search and strive for solutions that will both tackle climate change and support a just and fair transition to net zero. So we can't afford not to tackle climate change, and business sector has a hugely important role to play. Thank you very much.
Firstly, how we define and recognise communities is an important point to consider. Then there are geographical communities whereby people living within a specified locality come together. This can range from small areas such as a local neighbourhood group, or covering larger areas such as towns, citywide, or even an island. And then there are communities of interest, which could be your local sports club, youth groups, or people even coming together around their faith, culture, or common languages. Here in Scotland, we have been fortunate to have access to the Climate Challenge Fund, which has enabled a large number of community organisations and groups across the whole of Scotland to take action on climate change. There's been a focus on behaviour change and also a reduction of carbon emissions, and this has been at both a collective and an individual level. So what does community climate action look like? There are a range of activities that these groups can undertake. Projects such as Bikes for Good and Soul Riders enable individuals to make a transition into low carbon mode of transport. And they do this by providing cycling skills, building confidence, and even supplying bikes and protective gear. In addition to this, these groups have been instrumental in working with Glasgow City Council to create the Glasgow South City Way, a safer, faster, accessible cycle route. Then there are projects tackling fuel poverty and energy efficiency. Many of these projects link up with Home Energy Scotland to ensure households receive the appropriate measures to make these homes energy efficient and to save on fuel bills. Food is another area where community groups can tackle climate change, encouraging households to buy local and making considerations to low carbon foods in their diet, and where possible to grow their own fruit and veg in their homes, in communal spaces and in community gardens. These projects have also addressed food waste, looking at purchasing habits, using up leftovers and redistribution of excess food waste. One of the successes of the Climate Challenge funded projects has happened as a result of these groups coming together, collaborating on one big event, the Climate Festival. This is a fun and interactive exhibition which has food, music, highlighting and displaying the various climate-related activities to a much wider audience. These festivals have taken place in public areas like George Square in Glasgow and the Meadows in Edinburgh. Tackling climate change may not always be at the forefront of why a community group starts their climate action journey. However, through social issues, climate action is interweaved. For some communities, this is a delicate thread which intertwines with issues such as improving health, whereas for other projects, it is a sturdy rope that ties everything together. In many cases, tackling climate change has brought about additional benefits for communities. For example, improving social cohesion, improving health and well-being, reducing fuel poverty, creating employment, upskilling staff and volunteers. Community climate action goes beyond Climate Challenge funded projects. There are those that are connecting to nature, for example forest scores and conservation projects. Then there is the work of food networks, tackling climate change from a whole food systems perspective, while other organisations put their time and energy into campaigning and activism. With COP26 coming up to Glasgow next year, it is an excellent opportunity to bring all sectors of society together for a common cause. What more can be done? Let's move away from terminology such as behaviour change. This kind of language can have negative and harmful impacts. For instance, behaviour change implies that the way a person has been living is wrong and now they need to change. This can result in people becoming defensive and lead to inaction. So perhaps using alternative language such as positive steps or positive action towards a better future for all would be more openly received. Then there is a role played by communities and their perception. This needs to be reconsidered. Communities are part of the ecology of society, having the same value along with businesses, industry, academia, local government and policymakers. We should all be working side by side, co-creating solutions, having interconnected dialogues rather than being in individual silos competing with one another. Only together can we move away from the ego to the eco.